Hey everybody, Drew Dinkmeyer of Establish the Run here, and we've got another great deal with the good folks over at Fantasy Labs. We're partnering with them once again to utilize their optimizer powered by Establish the Run's projections to help you create winning NBA DFS lineups. This is the optimizer I use during the course of the NFL season. I will be using during the course of the NBA season as well. And this video screencast is hopefully to help you learn some tips and tricks to make better NBA DFS lineups. If you want more details about the deal we've got going on with Fantasy Labs, make sure to check the link in the description. All right, let's get into it. The Fantasy Labs NBA Optimizer. The first thing I want to highlight is the difference between NBA and NFL in terms of using the optimizer. In NFL, you will create a lot of macro rules. And what I mean by macro is big picture rules that help set the framework for your lineup. And a lot of these rules are positionally based. In NFL, you will think of stacking as creating lineups that have your quarterback paired with a wide receiver or a tight end, and so on and so forth. You will build out game stacks. NBA is different. The NBA is a game that is positionless by nature. Players are fluid throughout the positions that they play during the course of the game. And as a result, a lot of the decisions you're making in an optimizer and a lot of the rules that you're setting are more at the micro level. You're focusing on individual player correlations or players that you want to manage exposure to when paired with one another, as opposed to setting lineups that have big macro rules influencing them. So that's a big difference between NBA and NFL. So if we look through the Fantasy Labs optimizer, this is the player pool page. When you have the deal with Establish the Run, you'll have a drop down here that has Establish the Run projections along with Fantasy Labs projections. You can see that is the case in the NFL optimizer. You can toggle between the two. You also have a timestamp on when those projections have last been updated. We have not uploaded our projections for opening night just yet. We're about a week out from that, still working on those. But for the meantime, I can use the Fantasy Labs projections to show kind of everything that I will do within this optimizer. The settings that you'll consider for NBA are a little bit different than NFL, and this is why I said it's a little bit more micro-based than macro. In terms of this first page here on the general, there are some overarching settings that you will set in terms of how many unique players you want per lineup, what the range of outcomes you're going to consider for the players, and what max exposure levels you want at each of these positions. For me, during the course of NBA is more of a projections-oriented sport. The distribution of outcomes is much tighter. The game is iterative as opposed to big play dependent. In NFL, you can have a player break off an 80-yard touchdown run and represent over 80% of the points they're going to score on a given day. In the NBA, there's nothing you can do that will do that. If one play represents over 80% of the points that you've scored in a given day, it's been a very bad day for your NBA player. There's nothing they can do to get that many points all at once. And so that iterative scoring tightens the range of outcomes in the distributions, and it makes it more of a projections-oriented game. That's why myself and the team at Establish the Run spend so much time poring over the projections each and every day to make sure that we're providing an edge for our subscribers. So with that in mind, I do approach it differently than the NFL. In the NFL, I'll use wide ranges of outcomes. I'll introduce more variance into my projection set because I understand the distributions of outcomes are wider. I will have max player exposures. In the NBA, I generally won't do this. I'll allow things like range of outcomes and this new feature that they've created, Bounce, which, if you look at it, this is a feature that decreases a player's projection after they appear in a lineup, making them less likely to appear in the next lineup. And basically what it's doing is it's spreading out players, and that helps prevent clumping, which is an issue with optimizers at times when players that project well end up paired together more often than you might want them, and so they spread out. I will use features like Bounce and range of outcomes to lower my exposure to players as opposed to capping their exposure levels. Whereas in NFL, I will often cap exposure levels by position in order to make sure that I'm spreading out my exposures a little bit more. I'm a little more willing to be concentrated in my approach in NBA. In terms of the general approach here, what I want to get across when doing these videos is that this isn't like a slot machine that if you pull it the right way or it's the right time, you get the winning lineups. You want to be thoughtful in kind of your approach. There's no right answer or wrong answer to the the numbers that you choose in each of these categories. I will generally run 1 or 2 unique players per lineup. I will generally have a range of outcomes that's somewhere in the range of 20 to 30% in NBA, whereas in NFL I might go up to 40 or 50%. Max exposure I won't worry too much about, and then bounce I might use like a 10% kind of bounce to help spread players throughout the lineups. Max ownership percentage and different things like that. In NFL, I will use those tools a little bit more heavily. In NBA, I won't use them as frequently, simply because the difference between NFL and NBA is NBA, the whole landscape of a slate can change instantly, right within moments before lock if a player gets ruled out. NFL, at the very worst case, you have about an hour and a half before inactives, before the game kicks, for news to trickle in. So you have more time. So because you have more time in NFL, you can set up things more heavily from a macro perspective. In NBA, you want to set things up so that you can be tactical but also agile when news breaks, and that you don't have to take off a bunch of rules that you might have had simply because news breaks and you need to redo everything. So I will set some generic settings here just to give examples, but I will generally do something, in this range. And then you can do team limitations if you want. I rarely play in there. Position limitations, these are things where if you wanted to pair different positions, I won't use these in NBA. I will use them heavily in NFL where I'm trying to stack in different things. The exception would be in NBA. Maybe on FanDuel you would do something where you would limit to at most one, power forward from the same team or something like that. It's not a rule that you have to do, and it's not a rule that I will often implement, but on FanDuel, the game is a little bit more positionally influenced. On DraftKings, this multi-positional eligibility will end up filtering out players that don't play the same position and aren't risking each other's playing time. So I will not use very many positional rules. Player correlations, I will do things like, for example, you might want to, on this first night, you might want to say, okay, if I have Kyrie Irving in a lineup, it's probably going to be hard for Kyrie and Kevin Durant in the same lineup to really go nuts on the first game, given they're so expensive, right? Kyrie was over 8K, Kevin Durant is over 9K, so I'm going to say I'm going to decrease Kevin Durant's projection whenever Kyrie Irving gets into a lineup. And I might do things like that to help control the correlation of the individual players in the lineup. Whenever you're thinking of NBA, what you need to think of is, what are the paths to the most optimal lineup? And in those cases, how can I create rules or groups that give me a better chance of finding those paths? And oftentimes, when a team has 2-star players on bigger slates, it's hard for them to both get into the optimal lineup together without the game going to overtime. So maybe you'd create a rule that says, if I include Kyrie Irving, I decrease Kevin Durant. But if I include Kyrie Irving, I might increase a player that they're going against or something like that. Player groups are other things that you'd consider, and in this instance, I might say at most one of Jarrett Allen and DeAndre Jordan. These are 2 players that they're not going to share the floor together. Their playing time is directly impacted by one another, and as a result, it's unlikely that both of them end up in the optimal lineup. And so, while on the player correlation side, I want to decrease the likelihood that Kyrie and Kevin Durant end up in the same lineup. There are still scenarios where Kyrie and Kevin Durant can probably end up in the winning lineup, but I want to limit the ability for Jarrett Allen and DeAndre Jordan. And so I will use player correlations and player groups often, player groups especially, to limit players who impact each other's playing time directly. Think of situations like DeAndre Jordan and Jarrett Allen. Think of situations like a point guard and the backup point guard. Maybe it's a night where the backup point guard projects pretty well as a salary relief value play. You might not want him in the same lineup as the starting point guard if they don't share the floor together. Those types of things. I will also use the custom rules, and this is a good one where, an example of a custom rule will say at most one player where projected minutes is less than 25. you can do stuff like that. You can do it by position, you can do it by projected points, you can do it by projected minutes, and all this stuff is really helpful in terms of being able to create rules that make sure that you're getting players who are going to be on the floor a lot into your lineups, and you're not just getting a few salary relief guys kind of packed in there that aren't projected to play well but might rate as good values just because they're cheap. And so those are settings that you can use. And so the NBA is a little bit different. So I'll do at most one player that projects with minutes below 25. I'll use their example, which I think is a good one. NBA is a little bit different, and I'll just generate 10 lineups here. NBA is a little bit different than the NFL because of the news flow and because of the macro ability to create stacks and different things like that. If you do want to create game stacks in the NBA, which I think is a profitable strategy on the right slates, usually on smaller size slates, and I've got content over at Establish the Run that details what types of slates you should look to game stack, you can create those things by creating groups and rules that say, if I'm creating, so let's say I wanted to do, a game stack here with Brooklyn and Golden State. So what I'll do is I'll say, if I'm creating a group where I'll say at least 4 of Kyrie, Durant, DeAndre, Allen, Harris, and I'll just kind of go through the rosters. We'll put in Steph, we'll put in Oubre, we'll put in Wiggins, and just kind of go through the rosters, Draymond, and we'll say, okay, I want at least 4 of those guys, so I'm going to create a game stack, and I'm going to keep this rule as well, and I'm going to apply that. You can just add more, and I'm going to create 10 game stacks of that game and add it in. And so these are ways that you can do these types of things in the optimizer to create those types of correlations that you want, but you don't necessarily create full-blown macro rules that impact all of your lineups like you do in NFL with game stacking and different things like that. So it's a little bit different than the NFL, and if you're getting accustomed to playing NBA DFS with an optimizer, the thing that I would recommend most is setting up rules that you can that aren't overly restrictive, so you can strip away things on news. And one of the great things about the Fantasy Labs optimizer is Fantasy Labs is just the best news resource in DFS when it comes to NBA, and their news feed is constantly updating here as well. And between this, you'll have the ability to toggle between projections, our projections, which will have a timestamp when they're last updated, so you can see if it correlates and it's taken into account the news, and then you can quickly run things. You've got basically a command center at your disposal with the news, with the updated projections, and able to run lineups very, very quickly. Once you have all of your lineups, being able to upload these lineups and save these lineups is great. You can tag a lineup, and we'll say opening night 1. I'll tag those and I'll add them, and then I'll save these lineups, and then you can have each of the lineups that you move over and save to your My Lineups and Entries page will populate very quickly and very easily here, and you'll be able to move those lineups over to DraftKings or FanDuel depending on the site that you're working on. All right, so the lineups have populated here, and now I've got these tagged in, and I can just download the lineups if I want. I can randomize the order, which is a nice addition that Fantasy Labs did after one of my previous screencasts where I showed I was randomizing in Excel. You can randomize the order if you want, or you can just kind of download the lineups immediately. You can also edit the entries if you've uploaded your entries onto Fantasy Labs as well. So a lot of cool tools that they have at your disposal here. But really, most importantly, I wanted to highlight the importance of projections, the importance of following news along the NBA season, and the ability to think differently from using the optimizer in NFL than you are in NBA. NFL, you're creating a lot of rules that are big picture, game stacks or quarterback stack type situations. NBA, you're thinking more on the micro level, individual player correlations and how they might impact each other. You certainly can create game stacks, and there are appropriate times to do that. And I showed an example of the way that you can use the optimizer to do those things, but it's not where you're creating every lineup in a way that is highly correlated. NBA is more about projection and getting the best projected plays into the lineups as frequently as you can and trying to find that right combination, and less about correlation. And the reason for that is because projections are so important. The range of distributions and the range of outcomes is much tighter in NBA than it is in NFL. And that's why you really want to emphasize working and subscribing to a service that provides great projections, which we like to think we do over at Establish the Run. So that's it for this screencast edition. Hopefully this helps you make better DFS lineups and learn how to use the Fantasy Labs NBA Optimizer to do so, powered by Establish the Run's projections. I'm Drew Dinkmeyer from Establish the Run, and I'll see you next time.